The start of the season is upon us. UP Nation, Purple Gang, Skull Nation. Monday night starts it off with the Chicago Bears, and everybody's been kind of reaching out to me saying, hey, man, you haven't given us your record prediction for the season, what you think the Minnesota Vikings will end up, what you think the end game would be. And here's what I'm going to tell you, man. When I try to pick games, it's very difficult because I'm a big Minnesota Vikings guy to separate emotion from reality. And I think that's what you have to do when you start going game by game and picking wins and losses and stuff like that. It's very difficult for a lot of people to do. I was on a podcast with one of my guys back in Cleveland, and we were doing kind of the Cleveland Browns stuff, and he had the Cleveland Browns at 10-7, and I can't see that for the Cleveland Browns at all, but I think that was a lot of emotion. So the one thing that I'm going to do today is try to keep the emotion out of it and look at each game realistically in terms of what the Minnesota Vikings can win and what games they may stub their toe out of the 17 games. And so I take a lot of things into consideration, man. I take a lot of things into consideration. First game, obviously, is the game Monday night versus the Chicago Bears. I have been on point and I have said, and I'm standing firm on 10 toes, that I don't think this game will be close. I think it will be close early. I think JJ McCarthy, Caleb Williams will be nervous early. I can see some sloppy play. I can even see a couple of turnovers early. A lot of nerves, a lot of butterflies. Like, these guys are great athletes, but they're human beings as well, such as JJ McCarthy, who is our future franchise quarterback. I look at JJ McCarthy as being here for a long time, manning the helm for the Minnesota Vikings, but Monday night starts it all. And I think coming out, and I don't think anybody would blame him for this, there's a lot of pressure on his shoulders. I think he's going to be a little bit nervous. So that's going to attribute to the start of the game. But as people start to get comfortable, the Minnesota Vikings start to get comfortable, Donovan Jackson starts to get comfortable, JJ McCarthy starts to get comfortable, I think the Minnesota Vikings are going to eat. Adam Thielen is going to have a big game in terms of receptions and yards, maybe even a touchdown for the Minnesota Vikings. I think the Minnesota Vikings beat the Chicago Bears. That's a win for the Vikes. The Vikings start the season 1-0. The next one will be Skullfest weekend. Atlanta Falcons come to town. I've got a sneaky suspicion, UP Nation, a sneaky suspicion that we may see a little bit of Kirk Cousins. We may see Kirk Cousins on Sunday Night Football. Just because nobody is really expecting that to happen, I think Kirk Cousins is going to show up. I think the Minnesota Vikings are too much for the young quarterbacks. See, this is why this schedule sets up so well. Michael Penix Jr. is not ready for Brian Flores and that defense currently constructed. The Minnesota Vikings have all of the advantage in that game. Home crowd, home opener, going to be nuts. Sunday Night Football. All of the Vikings fans, they have a whole day to kind of get lathered up with all of their beverages to be able to come in Sunday night and make that environment tough for Michael Penix Jr., Kirk Cousins, whoever the quarterback is. I see the Minnesota Vikings winning that game as well. The Minnesota Vikings are starting off 2-0 for the season. The next week, you got Joe Cool coming in, and this is the game that worries me because no matter what you want to say about the Cincinnati Bengals and their defense, their offense is straight up bona fide. You've got two legit wide receivers, you've got a pretty legit tight end, and you've got one of the best quarterbacks in the league, and you've got a pretty good offensive mind in terms of the Cincinnati Bengals offensive coaches. That is going to be a tough one for the Minnesota Vikings and that Brian Flores defense, because the one thing about the Brian Flores defense is that you've got a lot of exotic blitzes from time to time, and some of those cornerbacks, safeties, are going to be on islands at times. And Joe Burrow has shown an affinity for being able to finding those one-on-one matchups and exploit those, especially when he has weapons like Jamar Chase from the Cincinnati Bengals. It is going to be tough. That is a game that is a hard one to pick. But out of the five, first 5 games, I think if there was a game that the Minnesota Vikings were going to stub their toe, it would be that one, because I think Joe Burrow can put up points. Now, I will say this. The Cincinnati Bengals have always had this thing that they do every year, this thing where they just start off slow every year. Their first 3 to 4 games of the season are always probably their most terrible 3 or 4 games during the season that they just don't play well. But they're manufacturing points all the time. Will this be different this year? I don't know, but they're walking into a tough environment, a Minnesota Vikings defense that can ball control. So I look at this game as kind of a pick'em, but I do look at this game as a game that the Minnesota Vikings can drop. So I will pencil this game in as an L. I hope I'm wrong about that, as an L for the Minnesota Vikings. Minnesota Vikings start off 2-1. Next is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, the Pittsburgh Steelers have made some additions on defense. Jalen Ramsey, Darius Slay, and the fellas, they bring in Aaron Rodgers. This is going to be a tougher game than people think. I like the fact that it's overseas. The Minnesota Vikings are undefeated overseas, so they must be doing something right in terms of their infrastructure and getting their guys prepared to play those games overseas. They must, as an organization, be doing something right. The whole jet lag, I've been overseas several times to compete. The jet lag and stuff is for real. So for them to be able to navigate that, hats off to the Minnesota Vikings. I think they will be a little bit too much. I think the only thing about Aaron Rodgers now is that he's not a mover. And I don't think their offense is anything daunting. I think their defense is going to be there. I think their defense is going to give JJ McCarthy maybe a little bit of trouble. But I do think because of their running game, they could take a little bit of the pressure off of him. This is where that offensive line comes into play for the Minnesota Vikings. I look at the Minnesota Vikings being able to beat the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Minnesota Vikings are 3-1 at the start of the season. The Cleveland Browns, their second game over in Tottenham in London, they're playing the Cleveland Browns. Now, I think the Cleveland Browns are a mess culturally. I think the Cleveland Browns don't know who they want in terms of support people, and their quarterback situation is a mess. They've got Deshaun Jackson starting an old Joe Flacco. They really don't know who they want their backup to be, whether it's Dylan Gabriel or Shedeur Sanders. When your organization is that noisy and is in flux, and I think Kevin Stefanski is one of the most overrated coaches in the league in terms of his ability to be able to game plan and play call. He has had a lot of failures under his belt, but somehow, some way continues to get these coaches of the year titles. And I think part of that is the floor is so low for the Cleveland Browns that if you do anything half decent, you're going to be looked at as this great coach. I don't think Kevin Stefanski is this great coach at all. I see the Minnesota Vikings running through the Cleveland Browns. They start off the season 4-1. There's your first chunk of 5 games. And I do think the Cincinnati Bengals is kind of a pick'em. I just don't like the aspect of Joe Burrow being who he is against that Brian Flores defense and cornerbacks having to be in those man-to-man situations against those wide receivers and Joe Burrow. It's the only reason why I think the Cincinnati Bengals could give the Minnesota Vikings trouble. But the Minnesota Vikings are 4-1 going into the bye. Then they come out and play the Philadelphia Eagles. If you watched the Philadelphia Eagles last night versus the Dallas Cowboys, I'm going to tell you this. The Philadelphia Eagles better find some cornerbacks because they lost Darius Slay. They lost Isaiah Rodgers to the Minnesota Vikings. They are not, and they're missing other pieces on defense as well. They're missing 5 starters from the Super Bowl team, along with guys that are injured. So I'm assuming that they're going to be more healthy going into that game. That's my expectation. So they're going to get some pieces back. But it doesn't fix the cornerback position. They better find some cornerbacks if they want to compete. The Minnesota Vikings on the defensive side of the ball and the offensive side of the ball, they're a much more physical team and much more equipped to handle the Philadelphia Eagles. I think most people have this as a loss for the Minnesota Vikings. I am going with a dub for the Minnesota Vikings only because they fixed the areas where they can now really compete with the Philadelphia Eagles. Offensive line, defensive line, the trenches, the Minnesota Vikings being able to stop the run, control the pocket area, and being able to ball control for that game, I look at the Minnesota Vikings as having their best chance to beat the Philadelphia Eagles since 2018, 2017 is, I think, the last time the Minnesota Vikings beat the Eagles. It's been a long time, but I look at the Philadelphia Eagles not being the same team as they were last year. I think the Minnesota Vikings get a dub there. Minnesota Vikings are 5-1. Los Angeles Chargers. I don't like this game. I think this is a L for the Vikings only because I hate the quick turnaround from the Eagles, a pretty physical team, to that Thursday night, man. It was the same thing last year when we went from Lions to the Rams. We don't play well going out to California on a Thursday night. We just don't play well. That is a tough turnaround. You essentially have to prepare for the two teams a week ahead of time. So you're doing double duty in terms of your prep. I don't think the Minnesota Vikings would ever admit this, but you have to, because after you play on a Sunday, you're probably going to give your guys that Monday off. You've got Tuesday, and then you're traveling all the way to Los Angeles on that Wednesday to get prepared for the game on Thursday. That is a tough turnaround against another physical team, the Los Angeles Chargers. If this was a home game, I would give the Minnesota Vikings more of a better chance. But because, again, they have to go out to Los Angeles, which is one of the worst places you could go after a bye that long, you just don't have the practice time. I can see the Los Angeles Chargers beating the Minnesota Vikings. Minnesota Vikings are 5-2. Then we come back November 2nd versus the Detroit Lions. I've been on record saying the Detroit Lions are going to be different. I don't think the Detroit Lions are going to be a playoff team this year. I think losing those two coordinators are a big deal. It is a big deal. I think the Minnesota Vikings go into Detroit. I think if they are semi-healthy for that game, I look at the Minnesota Vikings as having a good shot to win that game. They're going to be just possibly coming off a loss to the Chargers. They're going to have a week and a half ahead of time to be able to prep for the Detroit Lions. I look at the Minnesota Vikings going into Detroit, winning that game. Minnesota Vikings are 6-2 at the 8-game mark. That Sunday versus the Baltimore Ravens, I think the one thing that you can't prepare for, I think the best kryptonite against the Minnesota Vikings and that B-flow defense is what the Baltimore Ravens do. They've got Lamar Jackson, who can freelance, run around, can hit you with the pass, can hit you with the run. They're going to have a stout running game. Again, you're talking about ball control. The Baltimore Ravens are going to be able to do that, which lessens the bite at the apple that the Minnesota Vikings are going to be able to get in terms of being able to put the points to the board. Plus, they're going to be going up against a daunting defense themselves. I think the Ravens are going to be one of the best teams in the league, and they're just going to be hard to beat. I look at the Baltimore Ravens coming into Minneapolis, and again, man, I hope I'm wrong, but I see them beating the Minnesota Vikings. Minnesota Vikings are now 6-3. Here comes the rematch with the Chicago Bears. I think one or two things are going to happen. Either Caleb Williams is going to be more comfortable in offense, or Caleb Williams will not be a starter with the Chicago Bears by this time if things fall apart. I think the Chicago Bears and the Minnesota Vikings are just a bad matchup for the Chicago Bears. This game is a little bit more competitive from the Chicago Bears standpoint than the first game, because I predict the first game is not going to be close. It's going to be a little bit more competitive. I look at the Chicago Bears playing us a little bit tougher, but losing again to the Minnesota Vikings. The Minnesota Vikings will be 7-3 after 10. The Green Bay Packers. The Green Bay Packers traded away Clark for Micah Parsons, which means their running game, their ability to be able to stop the run is not going to be there. This is where the Minnesota Vikings and that offensive line and that two-headed monster at running back will really be able to exploit the Green Bay Packers. It's a part of the game that a lot of people aren't looking at. Like, do you think KOC is going to have JJ McCarthy drop back 20 to 30 times that game so Micah Parsons can get off? No. You're going to hit the Green Bay Packers were their weakest now. Their cornerbacks are suspect because they got rid of Alexander. Now they got rid of their stout defensive tackle in the middle. Minnesota Vikings are going to be able to run. I look at the Minnesota Vikings being able to exploit the run against the Green Bay Packers. The Minnesota Vikings beat the Green Bay Packers at Lambeau like we did last year with the sweep. Minnesota Vikings are 8-3 after 11. November 30th against the Seattle Seahawks and our guy Sam Darnold. If anybody knows the weaknesses of Sam Darnold and what makes him a little bit of paranoid or a little bit uncomfortable when he plays, the Minnesota Vikings do. I mean, we all saw it last year. I can't imagine Sam Darnold torching B-Flow's defense. I just can't imagine that in any form or any manner. I just don't see that happening. I think Sam Darnold comes out and tries to play a decent game. I think he has a couple of turnovers. I think he gets hit a lot. I think the Brian Flores' defense really rattles him. I think the Minnesota Vikings get a win in Seattle. That puts the Minnesota Vikings 9-3 at 12 games. The Washington Commanders and their quarterback, Daniels. I think that kid and what they've put together around him, it's going to be tough to stop. I think they become faster on turf. This game is going to be in Minneapolis. I look at this game as being a tough one. I look at this game, the Vikings coming off a pretty good winning streak here with Chicago, Green Bay. Seattle, I think they stubbed their toe against the Washington Commanders. I look at the Minnesota Vikings losing this game, getting an L. Minnesota Vikings right now 9-4 after 13. Then we travel to Dallas, December 14th. This is a game where I think the Minnesota Vikings will beat the Dallas Cowboys. I don't think the Dallas Cowboys defense at this time, the Minnesota Vikings are going to have a lot of games under their belt. JJ McCarthy's more comfortable. Our three-headed monster at wide receiver will be able to exploit a lot of different defenses out there, especially with our running game. The defense of the Dallas Cowboys has been depleted because they don't have a Micah Parsons, and I don't look at their defense as being that formidable anyway. I look at the Minnesota Vikings winning that game. Minnesota Vikings 10-14 after 14 games. The New York Giants, it's going to be hard to gauge because they can go a lot of different ways at quarterbacks. I do see the Minnesota Vikings winning that game. I see the Minnesota Vikings winning that game versus the New York Giants. I just think they're kind of still in that transition, that rebuilding mode with the New York Giants. I think the Minnesota Vikings will have a better team. If they are pretty much semi-injury free, there's no way I see the Minnesota Vikings dropping that game against the New York Giants. Minnesota Vikings 11-4 at this point in the season. The Detroit Lions, Christmas Day. I picked the Minnesota Vikings to split against the Detroit Lions. So if I picked them to win that first game, I can see the Minnesota Vikings losing on Christmas Day to get to 5 losses. Now the Minnesota Vikings are 11-5 during the course of the season with one more game left against the Green Bay Packers. And I do think the Minnesota Vikings will sweep the Green Bay Packers. I think the trading of Micah Parsons overall looks like a good trade. I just don't think it's a great trade for the Green Bay Packers. I don't see why everybody keeps putting the Green Bay Packers in the Super Bowl. A lot of question marks to be answered from the Green Bay Packers before I put them in that category. So those are my picks, man. I look at the Minnesota Vikings as being 12-5 this year, a playoff team, trying to look at games realistically to see where they could find their wins and where they could find their losses. I think the Minnesota Vikings will have a really, really good season. A lot of it hinges on, how well we play at quarterback. I think the defense is going to be there, and then all the weapons on offense are going to be there. So 12-5, UP Nation, you guys wanted to hear it from me. In terms of the schedule, 12-5 is where I have the Minnesota Vikings at. Depending on who we see in the playoffs, how healthy we are in the playoffs, will kind of determine what our playoff run is going to be and whether or not we can make it to the NFC Championship game and possibly the Super Bowl. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Minnesota Vikings 12-5 for the 2025 season. Please hit that like and subscribe button. Only takes a second. And as always, UP Nation, Minnesota Vikings, 12-5. You can book it right here on Unconventional Playbook. We will make sure to see you when we see you.